Yes, it's intimidating, it's embarrassing to be me here, but it is also just a rare and wonderful experience to have one's thoughts, often penned in agony and pain and with cross-outs and trashing them and so forth in the privacy of one's study, to have them engaged so intensely and so seriously and with such generosity. So I really do thank each of you for your work and for the graciousness that universally accompanied it. So last preface, I, like many of you, eschewed PowerPoint forever until last year, and I became persuaded by a few of my colleagues that it is a powerful leveler up. I don't always like it. I'm sometimes aggrieved and offended by it, as the rest of you are, but I realized, as this was explained to me and demonstrated to me, that it often can pull us all onto the same page and not leave behind those who might be less familiar with certain idioms, certain ways of thinking, and so forth, than others are. So I've resorted to it. I'm still a little bit of a novice. Let's make sure I can. I'm looking for. Yep, there we go. But that's why. That's why it's here. So I've been working for a while on something I'm very provisionally calling reparative democracy. This is democracy oriented by the enduring damages of the past to both human and non-human life, damages accrued from capitalism, colonialism, and liberalism powered by fossil fuels. As reparative democracy takes shape in relation to these damages, the past they indict, the future they condition, it breaks with liberal, social, and even radical democratic temporalities, that is, modes of relating past to future, ontologies, ways of figuring and relating human and non-human, and spatialities, understandings of where democracy resides and matters. I'm going to chart the project a bit in the first half of the talk, and then I'll consider one very small slice of it, political freedom, and then I'm going to consider listening as an element of reparative political freedom. So this talk is a kind of narrowing process. We begin with the crises besetting democracy, and the reason I begin here is to avert a misunderstanding of the project that would place it in the genre of what we political theorists call normative theory. Normative theory tends to treat the task of political theory as identifying the good and the right, if not the true, in a largely acontextual and ahistorical modality. By contrast, I take political possibility to emerge always imminently from existing social forces and vulnerabilities within them. That is, political possibilities are always historically conditioned by past and present powers, basic Marx, and also by the remainders or residuals of the operations of those past and present powers. Now, the second point is really important. If for Marx, newly emergent political forms are keyed to historical forces and relations of production, today we know they are also keyed to the historical damages, exhaustions, and effluence of human production and consumption, both ecological and social. Moreover, these new forms emerge where existing ones are manifestly unable to solve contemporary problems, and this is the situation that produces crises. Crises incite critique, both practical and theoretical, not necessarily accurate or adequate, let alone total. And critique limns new possibilities, though not only desirable ones. So I'm going to speak first of the crises, then critique, then possibility. Okay, the crisis of democracy then. Constitutional liberal democracy, it goes without saying, is openly challenged today by authoritarian and neo-fascist mobilizations and parties. It's institutionally corrupted by myriad maneuvers to deepen minority and white rule, In the US, this extends from gerrymandering to court stacking to the overuse of executive orders. Constitutional or liberal democracy is also spurned by tech execs and the Pluto technocracy they dream of. It's eroded by the supervenience of markets and the commandeering of state projects by finance. It's hollowed out by a constantly morphing form of governmental reason, neoliberalism, that waged both direct and indirect assault on the very worth, the very value of popular rule. It's weakened by deregulation and devaluation of education, especially higher education, and by the loss of accountable media, facticity, and reliable narratives. Today, it's further discredited as the century's most brutal genocide and ecocide is conducted by one nation claiming democracy's mantle, backed by the wealth and the might of others claiming the same. Together, these forces degrade the institutions, the cultures, the credibility of the form. This much we know. Both popular and erudite punditry rehearse it daily. But there are other ways to refract the crisis, taking a longer view. Let's try the return of the repressed. In this account, all of liberalism's compromises of democracy, from anxiety about popular power to imbrication with capitalism, are now biting back. From the Senate and Electoral College in the US, to the House of Lords in England, to the European Commission in the EU, liberal democracy has never featured actual popular sovereignty and has always sought ways to secure control of and against the masses. But these features are now so blatant and so brutal that populism, left and right, is the result. Populism. The basic definition is popular rebellion against elites or elite rule. Populism, in this understanding, is an organic retort to undemocratic regimes masquerading as democratic. Moreover, capital, the radically undemocratizing force with which liberal democracy has been twinned since birth, has never been more powerful, more wily, more deeply entwined with state projects, and of course, has never been more global, hence less submissive to the nation states that have traditionally housed modern democracy. In this frame, constitutional democracy is not just assaulted by the right or hollowed out by neoliberalism's antipathy to legislative intervention, or eroded by institutional corruption, or disdained by technocrats and plutocrats. It's also challenged by socialists as occluding real emancipation, by anti-racists as already subtending white supremacism, colonial slave regimes, their aftermaths, by feminists for whom rights and autonomy jostle against care and connection, by ecological and climate activists for whom the liberal freedom facilitating capitalist production and consumption have now radically imperiled the earth. Liberal democracy, with self-interest as its animating force and private property rights at its heart, cannot address the climate and biodiversity emergencies, the sustained neocolonial class and race inequalities, and the ongoing ravaging of people and planet by capital. This brings us to yet another way of framing the crisis. Liberal democracy as an exhausted historical form. Inapt to the global nature and complexity of the powers generating our most serious predicaments today. Unable to reckon with its own violence and its own exclusions, both human and non-human. An important part of what has brought us to this pass, carrying as it does, empire in its belly, capitalism on its back, and fueled by burning fossils, whose residuals do not, as Andreas Volkers notes in a jibe at Marx, melt into the air, but hang in it forever, as nanoplastics are now suspended in every body of water on the earth. The EuroAtlantic world, of course, has for decades been departing the post-war vision of nations governed by the rule of law, popular consent, advancement of human rights, and human welfare. Obviously, even this vision never extended from core to periphery, to sites of imperial looting or Cold War struggle, or to the disenfranchised and subordinated inside the West. All the terms of this vision, from rule of law to human rights, have their violences, their seamy undersides, their hypocrisies, Yet, born as it was in response to the ugly regimes and aggressive power politics in Europe in the first half of the 20th century, this was the vision that guided the building of Western social democracies and relatively peaceful cooperation among them. It was torpedoed first by the neoliberal revolutions closing out the last century, as markets and finance were unleashed to savage everything, including the social state, and legislative intervention was spurned as social engineering at best, totalitarianism at worst. On the back of this anti-democratic force, power politics returned with a vengeance, an element of the neoliberal revolution predicted neither by the neoliberals themselves nor their Marxist critics. Notwithstanding the evidence of actually existing neoliberalism and state communism, both the neoliberals and the Marxists imagined economics could and would subdue politics in the end. Perversely mirroring each other and treating the former as real, that is economics, and the latter as derivative, politics, neither appreciated that both distinctly human forms of power would endure, whether entwined or in tension, nor that a form of governing reason, featuring deregulated economic life, would in time deregulate political life as well, unleashing its brutishness from legal and institutional containers. Okay, direct and angry assaults, longer erosions and corrosions, challenged by the return of the repressed, historically outmoded, together these figure a crisis that calls not for restoration or resurrection or recuperation, but for critique and transformation. Indeed, one way to understand the right's success today is that it is far more willing to abandon this exhausted form than the left is. The right's objects of desire, ethno-nationalism, heteronormative families, unfettered wealth accumulation, police power, these may be backward-looking, but its aspirational political form is not. And failure to grasp this blinds the left to where the crisis-responsive revolutionary impulses are today. So, a crisis that calls for critique and transformation. But what kind of critique? Not of concepts, or what Sheila Ben Habib in her early years termed critique of the ahistorical, asocial, disembodied, moral, and epistemic subject of Kantianism. Talk about using someone against themselves. And while we must address the constitutive historical and epistemological elements of the crisis, for which the Hegelian practice of immanent critique is invaluable, if insufficient, we need to surrender, I would argue, the elements of dialectics, progress, and totality in the critical tradition that Hegel inaugurates and which extends from Marx through the Frankfurt School. We also need to modify immanent critique to make it less pure and sure, both because of the anti-colonial and anthropogenic norms that must be our polar North Stars now, and because critique has no necessary entailments once history loses its linearity and direction. Today we harness critique for our political projects without expecting it to deliver those projects, as the Marxist tradition always did. German sociologist and STS scholar Andreas Volkers, whom I mentioned a moment ago, argues that the temporal orientation of critique is inherently altered by the crisis of what he terms fossil modernity. All elements of modernist critique, he suggests, have lost, I'm quoting him, their prime source of nourishment, the open future once facilitated by fossil fuels. End quote. This feature of fossil modernity, in my view, also severs critique decisively from utopia. Not because all possible futures are dystopic, but simply because we will now never be free of the political and ecological residuals of fossil modernity. Residuals that, as we know from the new materialists, as we know from Volkers, as we know from all ecological thinkers, residuals that are themselves agentic in the making of planetary futures. This is as true of the politics of the post-colony as of rivers fouled with cadmium, selenium, and arsenic from mountaintop mining runoff, or plant and animal microbes learning to metabolize plastic. We will end fossil fuel use, or it will end us, but the immense and enduring social, political, economic, and ecological residuals of fossil modernity shape every aspect of every possible future now. Such is the unique history that the Anthropocene set in motion, and why we still need the term, whatever its limitations. Given this condition, critique at this juncture, Volkers argues, necessarily becomes reparative in orientation and form. In his words, the critical task is to reckon with lasting ecological destruction, to repair what can be fixed, and to care and grieve for the socio-ecological relations irreversibly severed. Practicing critique in fossil modernity means staying with the rubble. And of course, that's a riff on Haraway's Staying with the Trouble, which I've included in the bottom paragraph. Now, Volkers is focused primarily on ecological destruction. I want to argue for a parallel approach to the political form liberal democracy, the form that subtended this destruction and built empires from it. Reparative critique differs from the dialectical tradition in both form and content. Form: it has no truck with Geist, progress, antinomies, syntheses, totalities, emancipation, or inversions of these as regress, fragments, or domination, the inversions that appear in the thinking of the early Frankfurt School. Content: nothing is left behind, and the residuals of fossil modernity are themselves agentic in continuously transforming human and non-human worlds, from heating the planet and species collapse to human and non-human migrations in response to climate change. More than treating past damages or exclusions as either practices to be overcome or merely as candidates for reparations, reparative critique is oriented by futures both contoured and constrained by the persistent materialist legacies of hubristic modern powers of violence, extraction, exploitation, propriety, trashing, and neglect. This embeds reparative critique in a different temporal schema from critique bound to modernist frames. Above all, that beautiful Hegelian Aufhebung, cancellation and preservation as a dynamic of progress, collapses. Instead of negating the false or bad and preserving the true or the good in a forward motion of overcoming or reversing and regressing, a la Adorno and Horkheimer, reparative critique grasps earthly life as forever occupied by the effects of fossil and colonial modernity. Instead of a dialectic of progress bound to either human ideas, Hegel, or human material production, Marx, or a negative dialectic that retains the humanism but unbinds it from the sunniness of synthesis and progress. Reparative critique features the ongoing agency of forces or elements not dissolved, not negated, not overcome, but rather which continue heating, poisoning, deforming, or transforming conditions of ecological, economic, political, and even emotional life, and which shape all experiments and practices, including those of democracy. In short, not only the historicity, but the humanism at the heart of the critical theory tradition are finished. My point, put hyperbolically and polemically, exceeds the claim that critique must deal with the animate presence of the past in any future we might make. Rather, as Dipesh Chakrabarti taught, critique must now grasp the intertwining of human and natural histories and human and natural futures brought about by the Anthropocene. We can no longer be said to interact with nature, but rather we are an accelerating force of it. Conversely, what we called nature is now speedily changing conditions of human existence. This renders quaint, even tragic, Horkheimer's classic account of critical theory, in which he argued critical theory has as its object human beings as producers of their own historical form of life. If his reparative critique invokes different temporalities, ontologies, and spatialities from those of modernist critique, if it bears a different ethos and orientation from critique bound to totality and utopia, if it's humbled by past errors of progressivism and anthropocentrism, these features do not weaken critique's radical impulses. It's boring into orders of power to achieve incandescent expose of their effects. But it does bring critique closer to the ground, divesting it of historical meta-narratives, anachronizing many of its favored tropes, replacing the notion of man or even human at its center with imbricated earthly life. Let's see what happens when we bring this orientation to the crisis of democracy today. Okay, so we've done crisis, we've done critique, now transformation. See, we're still in the Marxist frame, we just jiggled it a little. We begin by marking the difference between the term reparative and the much more familiar and freighted one, reparations. Reparation, a noun, is a concrete practice of restitution, redress, atonement, or payment for historical wrongs that condition lives in the present. Reparative, an adjective, reorients and potentially resignifies the noun it modifies, resetting its conventional spatial and temporal coordinates. Reparations are deeds or acts relating to historical wrongs, moral, political, or economic. Reparative politics is an orientation and an ethos for crafting futures. It's an ongoing and unfinished endeavor, as fossil modernity and its legacies of democratic exclusions and violences are unfinished. Reparative critiques, temporalities, and practices are thus different from those of reparations, although it may include reparations. It does not collapse helplessly or fatalistically before the immense damages of EuroAtlantic modernity, but it also does not imagine that we may overleap those damages. It is in this regard radically untheological. We are neither helpless before the power of God, nor godlike in our power. Reparative democracy departs other forms by replacing modernist binaries, human, non-human, past, future, individual, common, culture, nature, political, economic, with imbrication and connection. In place of the trope, humans and their environment, reparative democrats live on a delicate, damaged planet with other species, by which we are either sustained and sustaining, or imperiled and imperiling. No life thrives apart from the common, and the idea of culture apart from nature, let alone culture mastering nature, is a terrible joke. In contrast with liberal social or socialist democracy, reparative democracy binds the demos to the non-human and to histories of damage bearing on the present and the future. Both of these binds or tethers alter uncomfortably for many the meanings and temporalities of justice, which in the Western tradition tend to be at once timeless and immediate, eternal yet presentist, concerned with outcomes for human individuals or of vast groups. All this is at odds with responsiveness to agentic elements of the past, in the present, and the future, and to the radical interdependency of life forms and future thriving for multiple species. In reparative democracy, the immediate needs and demands of the present cannot dictate the terms of justice, and individuals cannot be broken apart from what sustains us. This cannot replaces the liberal centering of justice on rights and on distributions, with justice centered on thriving and regeneration amidst interdependence. This doesn't mean that rights and distribution vanish, but these other terms, thriving, regeneration, and interdependence, govern. Reparative democracy also alters valences and practices of freedom, both personal or individual and political. Freedom sheds its identification with sovereignty and autonomy, and sheds too disavowals of all the powers, ripple effects, and differential histories and positionings that bear on its exercise. To mobilize human capacities for democratic, ecological, and social repair, freedom must take shape as relational, responsive, responsible. It's organized by residuals of the past and their effects on the future. Eva von Redeker has paved part of the way here in shifting from spatial to temporal coordinates for freedom. Neither individual nor political freedom lose their foundation in our singular species capacity to craft or govern powers for chosen ends, but this could not be further from license or entitlement limited by the human harm principle. Reparative democracy also entails a new iteration of robust political equality. It must be alert, of course, to deep histories of inequalities, of wealth, class, gender, race, hemisphere, and between human and non. Inequalities that shape discursive norms and agendas in democratic spheres. Mark spoke a bit about this yesterday. But there's also this. In reparative democracy, the voiced and the unvoiced cannot count differentially. This cannot necessarily supplement speech with listening as the democratic practice par excellence. And as we will see, it also requires listening differently than what is permitted through a colonial or anthropocentric ear. In this way, the democratic citizen, subject, and sovereign is transformed and expanded, and thus the very nature of political freedom, self-rule, is altered. Still, Pache Jacques Rancière, political equality in a reparative democratic mode is about more than counting or who counts. It exceeds measure by individual units and doesn't correspond precisely to representation. Democracy remains a distinctly human practice, but this now means being human as creatures who are entwined with our non-human others. How does this work? How do we tacitly, if not explicitly, enfranchise life forms that democracy has not previously bothered with, yet sustain all life, earthworms, coral reefs, rainforests, bee colonies, and more? What kind of equality and freedom affirms that their fate is in human hands, yet our fate rests with them? Framed philosophically, reparative democracy is rooted in that deep ecological materialism called for by Bruno Latour, what he calls materialism at last. Reparative critique doesn't simply grasp things by their root, as Marx insisted in his critique of Hegel. Rather, it further de-reifies the social processes Marx focused on to incorporate the soil nourishing the root, the historical residuals within that soil as part of what it upturns. As promised, the remainder of this talk is focused on political freedom. Political equality is democracy's prerequisite, but political freedom is its action, its realization. Democracy's golden promise is that we rule ourselves together in order not to be ruled by another or a part, the rich, the wise, the dynastic, the expert, or by impersonal forces, markets, money, technologies, church, bureaucracy. That we are politically free only if we rule ourselves is, of course, the meaning of freedom, castigated and overwhelmed by other meanings in recent decades. We need to both recover and modify it. So how do we enact political freedom? How does a people rule itself? This was, of course, Rousseau's most important question, when he struggled to land through a formulation of popular sovereignty separated from the state, but which kept sovereignty abstract and strangely silent, even when the people assembled to express the general will. And Norton, by contrast, insists on the noisiness of democracy. A democratic people, she says, expresses its freedom by making demands or articulating aspirations for the whole. Jason Frank, seeking to recover what he calls constituent powers, radical roots, suggests that this initiating power is inevitably the people out of doors, whether this is civil disobedience or insurgent assemblies. Liberals equate voting with citizen voice. Deliberative Democrats center fair and reasonable discussion. Habermas, of course, identified communicative action as democracy's essence. Notwithstanding their differences, these diverse threads of democratic thought all identify self-rule with voice. Hence the evident importance of speech to political freedom, and not just the other way around. Indeed, speech has been taken to be the consummate political act, at least since Thucydides, who took corruption of Athenian speech to index its cratering democracy amidst its reach for empire in the Peloponnesian Wars. Famously marked by the Athenian declaration at Milos, the strong do what they will, the weak suffer what they must. At that turning point in the war, force, not deliberation or persuasion, was all that mattered. We saw this reprised, of course, in the Trump-Vance sit-down with Zelensky. Thucydides taught that democracy dies when speech does. Aristotle supplied the philosophical underpinning to Thucydides' insight, asserting that politics is distinctly human because man alone of the animals is furnished with the faculty of language, which, Aristotle says, serves to declare what is just and unjust. Of course, in Aristotle, there was also the tendentious matter of agents and objects. He designated all that doesn't speak, both animate and inanimate, as mere instruments for what does. But what might be the violences, the exclusions of politics built on both this privileging of speech and the certainty that humans alone speak? If democratic citizenship is defined by the capacity for expression, whether at the ballot box, in court, the public square, on the ramparts, or in a planning commission, what of those, both human and non-human, who do not speak or do not speak in the accepted parlance? How do they become central to a common good at which the demos aims? How might we improve on the notoriously weak devices of guardianship, stewardship, non-human rights, constitutionalizing nature, conventionally adduced for the unvoiced? There is, in political practice and scholarship, an emergent practice of supplementing or even inverting the emphasis on speech with an emphasis on listening, hearing more, hearing better, hearing differently. This is also reflected in the exploding field of sound studies, which crosses humanities and science, digital technologies and ancient ones, humanscapes and ecoscapes, to build our capacities for using the hearing sense to become deeper listeners. I want to explore listening as a medium of bringing about reparative democracy, its citizens, its spaces, its temporalities, its ethos. First, as political theorists are wont to do, let's return to the ancient Greeks again for a moment. They may help us here even as they symptomatized the problem I'm trying to rectify. We're said, of course, to inherit both democracy and our free speech tradition from those Greeks, but they knew something about democratic speech that liberalism has erased. The three principles of ancient democracy, isonomia, equality before the law, isopolitia, equal standing for state honors and offices, and isogoria, the equal right to speak and be heard in the assembly. What? Not simply the right to speak, but the right to be heard in the consummately democratic space. Isogoria is the right to speak and be heard entwined, figured as one and figured politically. It is the political right of each to persuade the collective power, that is, the people. To speak outside the assembly was not isogoria, because not related to this collective power. Even the Greek notion of parrhesia designates more than speaking frankly or freely. Always a right linked to citizenship, Foucault reminds us, parrhesia does not have the status of a right exercised by birth. It's the freedom one has to be a good sovereign. Isagoria and Parisia thus identify practices of political speech and listening as constitutive of democracy, not derivative from it. Liberalism, however, privatized and depoliticized free speech, making it the personal right of individuals to express themselves any way and anywhere. Liberalism doesn't invoke listening, let alone the assembled citizenry, in guaranteeing free speech. It protects the individual right of expression, but no right to be heard. Indeed, the common defense against censoring offensive speech is that it can be ignored. Speech is free because it's presumed innocent of, or it was, innocent of political power and without power, thus not an action. From this angle, liberal democracy appears founded in a certain refusal of Thucydides' claim about what keeps democracy alive. This may also be why we don't think very well about free speech in politics today. On the one hand, we declare speech the consummate political act. On the other, speech in liberal legalism is personal expression, disconnected from democratic citizenship or sovereignty. The listening that I want to foreground is not limited to hearing silenced or backgrounded human voices, although this is essential in reparative democracy. Nor are speaking and listening merely two sides of the same coin, as philosopher Susan Bickford has it. Listening is more than the other side of speech because it's a medium of learning, transformation, and connection. It's a different political practice from speaking, and it has different requirements. Listening requires not speaking, of course, and being attentive and attuned, as most animals cock an ear to listen for prey, predators, water, or danger. And new practices of what sound studies scholars call deep listening, composer and activist Pauline Oliveros coined the term in the 1970s. Deep listening bears potential to bring into being democracies alert to the conditions of survival and thriving for both human and non-human life, historically excluded from politics. Deep listening, which involves what Oliveros called simultaneous, highly focused, yet global attention, as reparative democracy must have that dual focus. Deep listening aims at including more sound, more world, more than ordinary listening accommodates today. Focal attention is concentrated on a specific local sound, while global attention takes in all of the sounds around us, including those we might remember from the past or imagine returning in the future. Deep listening also entails both interpretation and translation, two vital practices of reparative democracies, and heretofore excluded by most democratic theory. From Mill to Rawls to Habermas, the democratic imaginary has been one of linguistic transparency and monolingualism. This won't do any longer. Let me return for one last time to Aristotle's claim that politics is distinctly human because language is. Other animals emit sounds, Aristotle notes, but only human language permits us to deliberate and judge together about what is right and just. If other animals don't do this, they do not have politics in the Aristotelian sense. Yet plant, animal, and earth science teaches us that most non-human life does speak, and that all life, from trees to whales, bats to coral reefs, listens to detect food, water, danger, or degraded conditions. Moreover, many species, including bees, worms, and plants, listen to each other to coordinate themselves for food, shelter, symbiosis, or defense. Nor does listening always require external ears. When flowering plants are exposed to the sounds of buzzing pollinator bees, they respond by producing sweeter nectar within minutes. Through electrical impulses, trees warn each other about parasites, grazing predators, wildfires. Tortoises gather through vocalizations they register as vibrations in their bodies. Almost all animals Almost all species listen to collectively thrive amidst contingency and change. We could call this politics. Humans need to learn to listen for exactly such purposes. Developing practices of deep listening can help transform us into reparative democrats, transforming the politics that currently sanctions irreversible damage to planetary life, both human and non-human. This doesn't require that we actively communicate with animals, earthworms, or soil, only that we become alert to their liveness and liveliness, what they need to thrive, and to our codependence with them. This is the domain opened up on the one hand by sound studies, and of course on the other by critical histories of indigenous people for whom, in some cases, such alertness was quotidian and not coincidentally, in some cases tended toward more sustainable relations with non-human life than fossil modernity features. The point isn't merely to displace anthropocentrism, but to overcome a politics of anthropectomy, in which we imagine and treat the non-human as our absolute other. Of course, the problem is, we are so inapt at listening. We have filled the world with so much noise, and we have so degraded listening relative to speaking, that revalorizing and training our listening capacities is nothing short of a revolutionary proposition. Compared to other life forms, humans have innately poor hearing. We don't hear infrasound, which permits elephants, for example, to communicate with each other across many miles. We don't hear ultrasound, which permits bats and sharks and dolphins to echolocate. And this impoverishment is inversely proportional to our noisiness. As terraforming and infrastructural creatures, we generate loud orders that further dim our already limited hearing capacities. Then we add noise-canceling devices to our cyborgian existence to wall out human noise along with everything else. Now we talk over those devices as well. The human cacophony grows, other sounds dim, including sounds of agony at the sight of organized human violence. We're also not easily inclined to hear earthly life in general, or apart from our own. Self, family, class, tribe, race, or nation often carve the limit of our listening, as the mass failure to hear incalculable suffering amidst contemporary genocides and ecocides makes clear. Listening to earthly life and our relation to it, known as bioacoustics and ecoacoustics, often require assistive technologies, amplification, even algorithms and AI that record and replicate cycles of life and death, from the sounds of glaciers melting and species vanishing to the sounds of coral reefs regrowing. As Karen Baker writes, these technologies can serve as a kind of Google Translate between humans and non-humans. The necessary infrastructure for deep listening also includes educational frameworks and political discourses, orienting us to post-humanist social relations and practices of alertness. German thinker Dennis Schepp formulates the transformative value of deep listening as he studies residuals such as iron sludge, residuals which Schepp argues often speak as barely audible voices arising from the debris of human history. Perhaps, he says, the key to overcoming the deadlocks of our time is to cultivate an openness to other non-human points of view and allow the object to step out of the inert materiality to which modernity relegates it. The object that is granted the right to speak irritates the conceptual distinctions that sustain our anthropocentrism. If democratic practices of deep listening, especially to the unvoiced, sounds too big, too hard, too fragile, too elite, consider that many indigenous communities were expert at it, and also that continuing on our current disastrous path is not an option. We know that almost everything about existing ways of human life must change for the planet and for Homo sapiens to thrive in the future. Why not democracy? More than merely a practical virtue, Listening to the unvoiced helps move political freedom into a reparative democratic modality. Quieting down to listen brings us out of ourselves, generating the humility and openness essential to a reparative ethos. Instead of the loudest and most amplified voices prevailing, which is what happens in all capitalist democracies, the requirement of listening, especially to what is challenging or foreign, evens things out, as Anne Norton would say. It also promises to break up hegemonic discourses with other accounts of being and experience. It brings about more voices and more variety among them to invite the reckoning with differences essential to reparative democracy. Placing listening at the heart of political freedom, instead of reifying nature and the foreigner, and fostering conceits of mastery, potentially invites a practice of co-living as it takes the measure of many agencies. Instead of locating political freedom in reason in the state, Hegel, or dissolving it into collective ownership and control, Marx, both of which entail those false conceits of mastery, we find it through creative political invention and engagement with what sustains us. Instead of oscillating perilously between freedom from and freedom to, we find freedom with, to mobilize human capacities for democratic, ecological, and human repair. Listening facilitates practices of political freedom that are relational, responsive, and responsible. To conclude, one aim of this work is to discover conditions and practices for orienting humans toward the earthly lives with which we are materially imbricated, but without devaluing our distinctiveness as creatures who generate orders of power that require human politics to modify, transform, and steer. A second aim is to simultaneously de-individuate and expand political belonging. Learning to listen to the sounds of life allows us to grasp differently our own belonging and the matter of who belongs. Third, listening to the unvoiced, that is, to sounds that may not be words or sentences, but has meaning and significance nonetheless, makes translation into a necessary and quotidian practice of democratic life, democratic understanding, and democratic representation. It makes resistance to monolingualism and its cousin, ethno-nationalism, into essential democratic practices. Of course, listening is not the only sense that we need to sharpen and deepen for reparative democracy. We need to see better and farther, smell more curiously and interpretively, touch more delicately and knowingly, less roughly, less ignorantly. Each of these abets our connectedness to other lives and life forms. Each has the potential to agitate, to activate, to soothe. Each invites curiosity and, above all, instructs. I dwelt on listening today because it's critical to reorienting Democrats toward the fragility and interdependence of life, and toward residuals of the past in any futures we might make, and because it augments the liberal preoccupation with speech. This places it at the heart of democracy in a reparative frame. Thanks.
Particular question, which is, yes, deep listening, of course, definitely, but the problem is when it comes to listening, when it comes to the when it comes to language, which is itself included within the dynamics of the Hungarian hegemony. The problem, or the concern I have is how to do that while at the same time trying to get away and avoid replicating the existing hegemony.
Butcher.
I think I have the same question, maybe in a different way. I'm also concerned about when you characterize deep listening and you start from the premise that we should stop speaking, but then we move to interpretation and translation, and maybe because I come from hermeneutic approach and language-centered democracy, but I see interpretation and translation also as a form, a very anthropocentric form of speech and representation. And I think it's at least troubling, if not, excuse my word, melancholic.
Melancholic. Oh, could you? No. Yeah, we need another sentence. Explain the melancholic.
In the sense that we start from not speaking, but then already in another form of speech, interpretation and translation.
So how is it melancholic?
In the sense that we kind of speak
We
again.
want to speak again.
Oh, okay.
So we desire our speech.
Hi, thanks. That was really cool. So I was wondering how similar your recommendation of listening was to Mary Scully's. So you come from quite different points. So she comes from deliberation as speech, but then she argues that for better deliberation we need to listen across difference to be mindful and privilege difference even in democracy. So I'm just wondering if there was a similarity between the two.
Can we do 3 at a time?
Yes. That's
Okay.
Stopping there. Sorry.
Okay. So avoiding existing hegemony. Breaking down hegemony is really difficult. Shut up and listen is a bit of a crude tool, but it is part of what I have in mind. And when I said it opens the possibility, if listening becomes a part of speech, and I'm not saying we don't speak, I'm not saying we put an end to speech, I'm saying that listening has to be foregrounded and not just listening to those we think we understand because of the language, because of the education, because of the form of reasoning, because of the rest of it. So human and non-human, learning to listen to sounds of life and the expressions of need and the expressions of despair and the expressions of crisis, the expressions of suffering, the expressions of regeneration that sounds of life can produce, has a potential to break the hegemony of a political sphere that is based on the idea that you participate to the extent that you can engage in powerful and persuasive speech to others in a hegemonic frame. So I am making a bid for listening to all those non-hegemonic voices, human and non-human, and all those voices now that would have the possibility of speaking in a non-hegemonic idiom and being, as it were, heard or engaged or leaned in to understand, that is the beginning of breaking hegemony. So that was also melancholic. I guess I'm going to just underscore what I just said to my friend over here. If we're not banishing speaking, but we're understanding speaking now or voice now in a much richer, broader, deeper, and more multivalent and more multi-species way than we do in ordinary democratic discourse, I'm not sure that that's melancholic. I think it has the potential to be expansive and exhilarating, and I think it has the potential to incite forms of, as it were, infinite interpretation and translation that aren't just how you speak it, but again, speak what you hear, but again, using all of the devices and all of the possibilities that are available to us now, both technologically and, I just want to say, at the level of intellect, to be able to interpret our world and hear our world, register our world beyond an anthropocentric and even within anthropocentrism, very limited form of voicing. So I understand your challenge at the level of melancholy, but I'm not sure that you would find most people who rely heavily on interpretation and translation in order to be heard at all, to find that they're riding in on a melancholy ship. So I'll leave it at that. I don't know the author that you're speaking of, and I need to. So maybe you'll tell me afterwards. Thank you.
Hold on a second, Wendy. I've got three. I'm afraid I have the last three questions.
Oh my
I think,
goodness.
already.
Okay, we'll
we're
be
at
quick.
22.
Let's do this like this, so maybe we can get more.
Okay, as quick as possible. Literally a sentence or two. One, Tim, did you want to? So 1, 2, and 3 at the back. And apologies for names. My memory is shot.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
And be really loud so they can hear you. Just
Can you
yell
hear
at
me?
me. Yeah, great.
So my question is, you're borrowing from sound studies and you are talking about deep listening. So I have two questions really. Why not slow listening as opposed to deep listening, which is also what sound studies scholars are doing? And where is the line between listening as radical action and listening as merely performative?
Okay, really quick. I want to say the issue, can we say that the issue isn't the voice, but it's speech and reasoned speech, in particular, thinking with Cabrero for more than one voice? That'll do. Yeah.
Wait. It was so quick, I didn't get it.
So, reasoned speech is the issue if we're thinking about the Western tradition. The West fetishizes the reason of speech, the semantic aid, the primate. And it's not the voice. The voice returns to the body, to the specific, to the relational, etc. So can you hold on to the voice?
Okay, yeah, sorry about that. So I was intrigued by what you said about living with the rubble of the trouble, and I was wondering about how this works in practice, and also if the residuals you're talking about might include those who, for whom climate denialism has an appeal because they're concerned about the cost of living, or because they've really destabilized ideas of a good life if they're caught up in fossil capitalism. So how do we then sort of listen to people like that, and how do we deal with the tensions and conflict that might come out within the deep listening practice?
Quickly, there was a whole long experiment with slowing democracy down while the world sped up. And I understand that impulse. And certainly that has to, I think slow listening has to be part of deep listening, but it's not always available to us. We can't always do it. But, I'm actually identifying a whole set of practices that as I suggested, I think many humans over the long life of humanity have been very good at, and that we're just getting worse and worse and worse at. Slowing down might be part of that. Slow listening might be part of that. Radical versus performative. Look, I come from a household where we don't use performative in a bad way. And I think that it's important to not make quite that distinction between radical and performative. And if you mean radical versus disingenuous, or radical versus, gestural, or radical versus just getting some more hits on your Blue Sky account, sure. But I think any endeavor at actually learning to listen differently and to some voices other than the ones that you're listening to, human and non-human, your world and other worlds, has the potential. And as we know, performativity can bring about worlds. Reason of speech versus voice. I'm just going to say, technically, speaking of the unvoiced is the wrong way to speak about what I'm talking about. But I also know that most people who are first thinking about listening to anything other than what they think they understand think everything else is not a voice. And so that's partly why I've been using what is admittedly a misnomer. But I don't want to limit my critique to speech, to a normative reason. It's beyond that. We're beyond Kant. We're beyond the critique of Kant. Where's my friend who still wants to argue with me about Kant? He's somewhere. And residuals. That's all I wrote down. Oh yeah, residuals. And I I don't want to call anybody residual. And I don't want to call anybody's investment residual. The residuals I am speaking of have to do with the literal effluence and ways of marking the earth, saturating the soil, toxifying the water, but also carving up the world, like global north and global south, that are not things that are going to go away with even a revolution, were there to be one on the horizon, or were we to know what the hell we mean when we talk about revolution. Those things are going to persist into the future and persist into making futures. And this is why I'm being so rough on the Hegelian Marxist tradition. Even though it forms me, I'm in it, I'm never leaving it, it's my residual, there's no doubt about it, but I'm being so rough on it because I do think that the trick of Aufhebung, which Marx took over, continues to allow us to dream that if we were to get power and we were to have that revolution, we could leave this hideous world behind. And it's not just the ecological residuals that we will not leave behind. It's not just the nation-state residuals. It's an entire way of humans having lived on the planet for the last 400 years that is with us now forever in the futures that we make, but that needn't be a premise for despair unless we're melancholically attached to that older tradition of overleaping our past and building a bright new future as we wish. And so residuals for me have to do with that long arc rather than any particular investment. See, we have 5 more minutes. We do.
So
we can have 3 more questions.
Wendy said we can have 3 more questions. We are going to avoid extractivism and stick with the residuals of the Hegelian tradition.
Okay.
We will have a quick wrapping up, an Aufhebung, which will be very quick from the 3 of you, if that's okay. And then Wendy can choose what she'd like to respond to.
And you can ask the rest of these people questions.
So, sorry, there was one here. Catherine at the top, and
Lucille was the very first.
Lucille.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm so sorry.
Thank you very much for the talk. I have a question on passivity.
Really loud, so that people back there can hear
I have a question
passivity.
on passivity. So I've heard on your stress on listening this critique of the Hegelian Marxist activist paradigm, according to which human beings are understood mainly as activity, spontaneity, working being. And my question will be, is there this critique of the activist paradigm in the conception of human being, and the sub question if phenomenology can be a methodology you can use in reparative critique.
Great, let's do this one really fast. Yes to phenomenology, no to the passivity. I am not trying to deactivate human beings in any way. We need to become much more active and alert, but as a different kind of human. Humans who understand that we are not separate from the non-human. And so it's a different, the 5 millionth person to have said this. It's not an original argument. It's an orientation toward a subjectivity in relationship to a subject relation to a different kind of object. Mark, yes, you're right. That is still transforming, still terraforming, still building worlds, still in charge of itself, but in ways it never has actually managed to do.
Thank you.
Catherine.
My question was about methodology, because I understand listening as a practice, and it was super illuminating for me to hear you talk also about it as an emerging practice that you see in many different places. And I was wondering how you see, the role of the theorists and the methodologies that we use in thinking in relation to deep listening, and if they should change, and how.
Yeah, sure. Of course. I don't think much about method. I was raised on anti-method, but I appreciate that was just a peculiar formation. Deva shares it with me. But of course, I am actually arguing for ways of theorizing and ways of thinking, as well as being political subjects that are hard. Really hard, because we're thinkers. We're all thinkers. And we're used to thinking in a very disembodied way. most of our bodies go away while we're thinking, and it's only when we look up that we realize we're twisted into a pretzel in front of our computer in these pathetic, disembodied, actually body torturous ways, and that we have not been hearing the owls outside. We have not been hearing the fact that the rain started coming down and our roof is leaking. We have not been hearing all kinds of things in the world except the annoying leaf blowers and other things that are interfering with our thinking. So of course part of what I am seeking for is a different kind of embodied thought, but it's very, very hard for most of us to achieve. And last,
Lucille.
Hi, I was wondering if you could say more about division of the reparative and whether
division of
the reparative, like the reparative democracy, and I was wondering if the reparative was a tribute to Cedric reparative reading, the idea of excavating sustenance from a culture that was not meant to sustain us.
Yeah.
And I'm asking the question also as an opportunity maybe to say a bit more about, the whole conference was about you deep listening to the political theory canon, and I don't think we've heard a lot about the ways in which maybe queer and feminist theorists were whispering to your ears. And so I want you to...
Yeah, okay. So the question is a wonderful one. As some of you may know, Eve Sedgwick shot a fire across the bow at a whole bunch of us with an article that accused classic critique of paranoia, and tried to substitute for it a notion of the reparative, which she drew from psychoanalysis. I'm not going to rehearse the whole argument here, but I will say in brief, I can't stand that argument. I think it produces a binary between critique and reparation that is precisely the binary I'm trying to collapse. I also think that she was trying to draw back from critique and in many ways make queer theory about an affirmation of this life here, now, with modifications as opposed to being these sharper and, as it were, more at least neo-revolutionary kinds of critiques. And I was very saddened by that article. I remained very saddened by it. I think it took queer theory in a particular direction. That said, I'm also very engaged by it. I'm very engaged. I mean, Robin's absolutely right to say, where is, I think it was you, Robin? Yes. Where are those voices in this work? Why am I so engaged with the big guys here and not talking about all the ways this work has been fed by these other voices? And the quick answer is, I think in part I'm trying to, this project launched initially as a quarrel with those who felt like, who work in democratic theory, even radical democratic theory, who are keeping it really bound to a particular kind of humanism. And I'm trying to get the humanism out of it. Not the human beings out of it, but the humanism out of it. And so that's the focus of it, but it also means I'm rethinking the big guys in relationship to it. But the one other thing I would say is that we really run a risk these days, and it's a risk I'm willing to run in certain audiences, but not others. I would have been willing to run it here, of a critique like mine and a formulation like mine being turned into a part of the genre of social reproduction and care work that would cordon it off from an engagement with ecological politics, with democratic politics, with anti-authoritarian politics, and with a whole bunch of other things. So that's the other reason that I didn't feature those influences, but they're there. I'm not trying to actively bury them. Okay.